And I will share my screen. And okay, so let me just get rid of the Zoom controls. They're always in the way. Okay, do you see my screen?
I do.
Cool. So the way that the fastest way to iterate in terms of just seeing like the raw HTML changes. Well, okay, let me just back up for a moment. Let's talk about the let's talk about how we do markdown processing. The bulk of the work happens here in utils v5. And
what's SV5 stand for?
v5 is because we had like v4 and v3. Like this went through a lot of iteration, and so we just kept on incrementing the version number.
Got it. But v4 isn't checked in anymore, right?
v4 has been deleted, actually, so we've managed to deprecate it. Okay. I'm also going to create a note for this, so like any files we reference, I can just send you a bunch of links at the end.
So this is the file that's responsible for like parsing the markdown.
Yes. And the structure of unified, I don't know if you were able to go into the unified, but let's me see if I so we use the unified mini framework to do parsing, and unified has this concept of a processor. The processor is the thing that is responsible for parsing text, transforming text, and then compiling text. And let me put it in here. So you have a processor, and then it does three things. Parse, this takes text and then turns it into AST text. You have compile, which takes AST and then turns it into text. So you have one, and then you have transform. And what transform does is it transforms AST and puts out another AST. And the way that unified is structured together is you parse markdown, and then you transform that markdown into HTML AST, and then you compile that HTML AST into actual HTML. And the architecture is a little similar to Express in the sense that you have a bunch of different plugins, and you kind of chain them together using the use. You have your hand up. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so I did look into Rehype and Remark a little bit. So Unify just like pulls those two systems together. Is that kind of how that works?
Yeah, so Remark and Rehype are just plugins within Unified. So you can think of Unified as Express, like the Express app, and then Remark, Rehype, those are all like plugins that you can plug into Unified using the .use method.
Okay, so this line for this file, this is where it's all getting put together.
Yes.
And it's referencing just a bunch of things from this file, basically.
It's referencing a bunch of what?
Parts from this file.
Parts from this file?
Code from this file and from this package.
Yes, and these are a bunch of different plugins. So Remark Parse is able to parse Markdown. And then the font matter plugin is able to recognize font matter. All of these are various other things. The stuff down here, this is all custom plugins that we've written. So NodeRefs is the plugin that is responsible for detecting node references and compiling them.
Which is what the bulk of what I'm doing here is being affected by. Got it.
And so for the node references, if we actually go to it, node references, I'll just put this down here. It has a plugin interface. And so a unified plugin can have a parser, a compiler, and a transformer. These are the three things we just talked about. So a plugin can implement one or more of these methods. And for our case, for the node reference, we have a parser, and this parser is responsible for recognizing the node reference syntax, which is the exclamation point, bracket, bracket, and then transforming that into a node reference AST. Now, the thing that might not be immediately obvious is the compiler, which is responsible for transforming that AST back into text. It actually doesn't handle the compilation when we do publishing. The compiler, what it handles here is, and here is another kind of Dendron specific addition to this, is that when we use a processor, we pass in a special variable called destination. And destination, there are different destinations that we can compile the text into. We used to use a different preview. That's what MD Enhanced Preview was. You can ignore this now. It's not used anymore. But the different targets that we can compile Markdown into is regular Markdown. And so for regular Markdown, for example, you would take a node reference and then you would extract it and embed it as regular Markdown. That's regular Markdown. We have an identity transformation. So this is like taking Dendron Markdown and transforming it into Dendron Markdown. The reason we would do this is just like on rename, for example, we want to extract links and rename those links, but we still want to keep the format to be Dendron Markdown. That's why we have a Dendron Markdown destination. And then HTML. And the HTML destination is used for the preview and for publishing. And then for destinations, we also have another argument called flavor. And so for flavor, it's like an extra property of the destination. So what this means is, for example, if you're publishing to the published site, the user can specify what nodes they want to keep private and what nodes they want to publish. And so if you are publishing to HTML that with the publishing flavor, then we need to do a check before we compile. Can we actually compile this link, or do we need to substitute it? And then the preview flavor is compiling for the preview. The hover preview is when you hover over like a link, will show you the little hover. It behaves a little bit differently, so there's certain affordances, but that's the flavor basically takes care of like little variations within a particular destination. And what you're concerned about is the publishing. So like what you'll be affecting is primarily publishing to HTML with the publishing flavor.
Okay. So you just showed me that there's a ref processor, and then it's got a way that you could pass in the process flavor and the destination. Can you go back to that function real quick?
This one. Yeah, so under the ops, so you have.
That's where it's taking it. That's the mode in the flavor.
Yep.
So when you instantiate the processor, that's where it's getting passed in. Okay.
And most of this should be pretty, like, it should not be things you need to directly work with, but it's just useful to be aware of.
Yeah, totally.
And so the node reference here, this is what is responsible for parsing a node graph. It is also responsible for compiling the node graph if the destination happens to be Dendron Markdown. But for all other destinations, the work of transforming the node reference actually happens in Dendron Pub. So Dendron Pub is not a great name. It's become a catch-all for just various forms of transformations. The reason we transform this instead of compiling this is because we use rehype to compile into HTML, and we don't want to have, and so because that is solely responsible for doing the HTML, anything that we want an HTML representation of, instead of generating the HTML in the compiler, we put it in Dendron Pub and transform those tokens into the HTML equivalents so that rehype can compile that as HTML.
So Dendron Markdown translated into HTML HT.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes. And so this is why we have essentially a giant switch statement that checks, okay, for the given node type, are we getting a node reference? So left link v2 is node reference. We used to have a different formatting for node references. That was v1, which is now no longer exists. And then for this transformer, if we're doing markdown Dendron, then we don't do anything because that is the one case that we actually do handle. But if we're not doing markdown Dendron, then what we want to do is we want to convert the node reference abstract syntax tree into the HTML abstract syntax tree. And that's where convert node graph AST v2, that's what it's responsible for. And so when it has some helper functions to just organize the code, it does a check so that you're not just so you're not like embedding a node into itself. But the meat of the logic is here. And there's various things it checks for. Like, for example, you can node reference with a star, which means that you get everything under that hierarchy, which is what this is checking for. So that's like you're referencing multiple nodes. Otherwise, you're referencing a single node.
Wait, so you can reference multiple nodes in the same tag?
Yeah, so the way that would look like is if you do like a foo.star, for example, then that would get all the children of foo.
Okay. And so then when that gets rendered, it's just like, is that multiple, like, would that be multiple iframes after this case is done?
It would be multiple iframes, but that is all being generated by the same method. So in the end, you get this node graphs object here. It's a list. In the case where you have a wildcard, you have multiple. In the common case is just one. So you just have a list with a single element. And then for this node graph, what you do is you go through every single node graph and you call process reference on it. So process reference is responsible for the rendering. And under process reference, first it checks, are we publishing? And if it's publishing, can we publish it? Because if we can't publish that file, then we just replace it with an empty paragraph. So we don't leak info. Otherwise, we extract the body and then we convert that body into like the abstract syntax for the HTML. And if pretty refs are enabled, that's like to show the little border, which by default it is, then what we do is we render the pretty one version of this, which is this div thing that has a link in the portal header and the backlink and blah, blah, blah. So this is the function that you would be changing. So if we are publishing to HTML and it is of the publishing flavor, then instead of this stuff over here, it would be an iframe.
Yeah. Okay, I'm following this. And then I don't know if you are done explaining the processor. So this all gets spit out, and then we're at the end going to be wanting to publish a bunch of HTML files or JSON files, maybe, to a directory for all the different refs.
Yep. And the place where that is being called is under next. So Next.js export pod. We have a method, so render body to HTML, and render body to HTML gets called on every note that gets published. It calls render note, and render note calls NDU tills proc rehype. So, and if you notice, we pass in the publishing flavor here. And
so it's like the entry point for running the processor on all the nodes. Right here in this pod.
Yep. If you wanted to test this end to end, the fastest way I would say to do that is if you were to just create a new workspace. So in this case, I'm just going to launch a new tutorial.
Yep.
So this is Dendron tutorial 37. I've gone through this a few times. And then what I would do is like create a hello note. And then inside of hello, I would, embed tutorial. And then what I can do is, well, the first time I run this, it's going to take a little bit of, don't want to do this under notes, want to do this under the workspace. But Dendron publish, it's going to download the Next.js stuff. And then Dendron publish dev or Dendron publish export will generate the HTML for this.
And if you're using the CLI that's linked from our main repository, is this doesn't it pull the Next.js template from GitHub?
So when we run this right now, this is pulling the Next.js template from GitHub. But what do you call it? Because the generation, like the export part, that is built into the CLI. So any changes you make in the Next.js template wouldn't be pulled in here, but any changes you make, like the Next.js export pod that's in the CLI, those changes would be reflected if you run Dendron publish dev or Dendron publish export.
So at the very least, like if I run this, then I can see the files that get created.
Yes.
Can you show me that in your file explorer, like where those files are when you run
Dendron
publish dev?
So for this, well, one day that will load. Under the file explorer, I'm just going to split this pane. So under the file explorer, this is under .next. Actually, let me think. It is under .next, public, data, notes, and then it's the HTML is by the note ID. So
okay, so if you refresh your file explorer on the left, it'll show up there as like a .next file got created in the local workspace.
Yeah, so it is created in here. It's just get ignored, which is why it doesn't show up here. But this is what the end file looks like, and you can see the iframe here, and this is the rendered version of that. It might actually be faster just to export it than to run the dev server on this, because the dev server slowed us up. But this is how it looks like right now.
And to export it, that's Dendron publish -- export or something.
Yeah, just minus without the --.
Dendron publish export.
Yeah.
And that'll put it in the same spot, that just won't run the dev server.
It will put it in the out folder. So location is slightly different, and then but otherwise everything else is the same.
And so my goal here is like when I run this command and when I look in that data folder that gets generated by the publisher, I want to eventually, like, end goal would be to have a special refs folder with like the JSON files or the notes to be in, so that can be picked up by the get static props that it is building the pages in Next.js.
Yes, and what will help with this is, let's see.
Yep, I've seen this file.
Yep. So the diff here,
a lot of it's here.
Yeah, it has a lot of that implementation already. So it will already like generate like a new JSON or a new note for every ref as HTML, and yeah, this is like that generation code. It's wrapping up the iframe in a tag.
And did you make this code, or did someone before me make this code, or where did this code work?
It was a joint effort. I did the initial part of this, and then we had somebody else that was working on the styling. But actually, I think for this one, I did this implementation here.
Now, I've tried to like use a git command to merge this diff into my branch just to like see if it would work, and instead it was like corrupted on like a certain line, so I failed to be able to do that. But I was able to like get a diff tool and be able to like scroll through and copy and paste code line by line in here. But yeah. I was just wondering if you like had an idea as to the best way to leverage this diff file.
I would say do what you did, because this diff was created like a year ago. Like the code base has changed a lot, and this hasn't been updated since it was created. So it would be pretty difficult to just merge in. It would be easier actually just to lift the parts that you need.
Okay. Well, overall, this has just been huge, because now I feel like I understand better how everything's operating. Can you maybe real quick just show me when you run that command in Visual Studio Code, how that pipeline, or I guess you're not running a code in Visual Studio Code for the publish, you're running it from the CLI.
Yeah, but you can actually have a much quicker feedback loop if you run this from the tests. So if you go to Node.ref v2 spec, for example, we have a bunch of tests that go through and create snapshots based on the output of these processors. And the reason these tests are a little bit more elaborate is that we built in a harness that will run each processor under every destination with every flavor, so you can check like a specific combination. But if you just wanted to, for example, see what the HTML looks like, or yeah, if you just wanted to see what the HTML would look like, you can run the watch command on this particular test to watch it. And let me make sure that I am, where am I? I am where I want to be. So this runs all the tests, but it also generates snapshots. So for certain tests, for example, if we generate the snapshot, it actually dumps the HTML contents out. And what that means is, if we take this common cases, what we can do is, for example, okay, so this is common case, regular case, blah, blah, blah. So these are a lot of different test cases. I think we run them all at once at the end, which is why this slows down a lot. Yeah, so these are all the test cases, and then we run through all of them. This is actually using the old harness, so it's not like the best example. The new harness, I think this one is using the new harness. No, that's also the old one. I think under V5. Here we go. This is a clean version. Don't look at that one. Look at this one. So let's see. So this is creating a node graph when the ACID prefix is set. And so we're checking that the snapshot stays consistent and that that prefix gets added. So what we can do is we can limit the test. So I'm going to cancel this watcher so we can chart the watcher here. What we can do is we can say only run this test, like this ACID prefix. And then what's cool here is that if you change anything about the output here, like bar MD, I don't know, foo, it will rerun the test and it will also regenerate the snapshot. So you get to see like the line changes in the HTML, and the turnaround time is like a second.
Great. Real quick, can you show me how you ran that from the command palette?
So the task I'm watching is the test watch root.
Okay, so you started off with run task. I don't use run task, and the run tasks run task, and then select yarn watch, and that'll just hit the open file.
Yep, and this is also for executing a unit test. We have the run task. So this goes into this runs all the tests. But do we have something on watching the tests? I think we do. Yeah, so run a single test. That is the docs for that.
Awesome. Well, that will be helpful.
Yeah, and then also similarly, when you are doing the export pod, because this task will consist of one, generating the HTML for the iframes to source one, and then changing the node graph to be the iframe. We also have a Next.js export pod that it verifies if like the assets were generated. The fastest way of doing turnaround, like to test your changes, I would say, is just to rely on the tests, because like all our tests are basically integration tests. We actually run through the code. We don't mock anything for the most part. And so what's nice is you can watch the test, you can make the changes, and it'll update in real time. And you'll also see diffs in the snapshot to see exactly what changed.
So the Next.js export pod test is the way I can check how the files get generated.
Yeah. So I'll put both of those test cases down here, but these are the, this is where I would start off with when you're iterating and trying to do like that write, test, compile cycle.
Great. This is huge. I'm glad I didn't like stay in the weeds so long and just kind of waited to chat with you about this. This is good.
Yeah, and then the last thing is, you mentioned the Next.js export, and like when we run this from the command line and we call Dendron publish init, this doesn't actually use the Next.js template that we have. It should be okay for this task because actually you might have to change the styles for the iframe. So you might have to edit the Next.js template. The way that you can use the template that you have checked out is if you go under Next.js template. You can use your own.
Just like using Vivaldi or something like that, local NPM registry.
You don't need to. So what you can do is you can specify where the CLI generates the JSON files. So actually I have one under Kevin. So what you can do is instead of running Dendron publish dev, you can run Dendron export pod and then replace the destination with the location of the Next.js template on your machine. And this will generate the files. So I'll add this into the notes section. But for example,
this will just copy that whole Next directory into the data directory inside of the Next.js.
Yeah, so instead of like importing the Next.js template and doing all that stuff, what this does is it generates the JSON and puts it wherever the destination is. And in this case, I'm specifying the destination to be the Next.js template that is on my machine. And when I do this, then I can now, well, let me just check what machine am I logged into. Okay, and when I do this, I can then go into the Next.js template, and when I can just do yarn dev, and this will run it with the data that I have. Well, once this thing loads. Or do I already have something on the port? Oh, wait, this is the wrong computer. I'm SSH'd into my Mini, so this is the right computer. Yeah, you can do yarn dev and yarn export, and those are equivalent of doing Dendron publish dev and Dendron publish export. But if you make any changes in Next.js template, this is how you can test it.
Yeah, I've done that before.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, great. I think that is that's enough to get me through this case.
Yeah.
Appreciate you taking the time and recording this. This is going to be useful. I'm probably going to watch this one more time.
Yeah, no problem. I will. Yeah, I'll upload it after this and I'll let you know when it's done.
Sweet.
Any other questions or things I can help with?
No, I think that's good.
All right. I'll stop that.